Welcome, ladies and gents. Crystal Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter for boxing related tweets, or you can subscribe to the channel, click that notifications button and get a new notification whenever a new video is uploaded. Let's talk boxing. Let's start off talking about Manny Pacquiao. I did a video very recently where I was discussing if Manny Pacquiao beats Errol Spence, would that make his legacy greater than Floyd Mayweather's? And a number of people took exception to that. You had, and this is how I know I was neutral and did a good job in being neutral, because I was attacked from both sides of the aisle. If one set of fans was pleased with what I was saying and the other wasn't, I would have known that I wasn't neutral. What I sought to do was be both the defense and the prosecution, to give you both sides of the argument. So I would often make a case and then say, but, and give you the opposing argument, and then say, but, and give you the other opposing argument. Because I want you guys to see both sides of the aisle and make the decision. You guys are the jury. I was giving you the defense and the prosecution's case. That was what I was seeking to do. Now, what I did say at the end of the video is that I personally would have preferred to have had Floyd Mayweather's career based on my personality traits. And what I meant by that is that for me personally, to have never tasted defeat and to also have been in great fights, you know, a lot of people were making out like that's all Floyd's got. Well, that alone shows an incredible level of bias. If you think the only thing he did was have an undefeated career, then what do you want me to say to you? Okay, you know, but that alongside beating the one rival I had that everybody said I'd lose to, the biggest rival, my nemesis, to get the better of him, to me, that would have been the icing on the cake. Losing to him in that fight, it would have been something that I would have struggled to deal with personally, mentally. I'm talking about myself. You guys might have preferred the love that Manny Pacquiao got. He's considered a lot more exciting, obviously, than Floyd Mayweather. And while that is subjective, I think the majority of people will agree that his style of fighting is something that would get you on your feet. Whereas Floyd, that certainly wasn't always the case. There were moments, but it wasn't always the case. And a lot of people do equate excitement to greatness. Again, that is subjective. That's something that Fight Film made the case for, which is ironic considering he often talked about the only objective way to analyze this is to look at trinkets and titles and things like that and focus on that. So he wants to, on the one hand, look at that, but then when it doesn't suit him, he wants to start questioning excitement and who was more exciting and things like that. So let's talk about some of these things, shall we? First and foremost, the most common comment I got. And by the way, I'm going to criticize both the Manny Pacquiao position, the fans of the Manny Pacquiao, their position, as well as Floyd Mayweather's fans, their position. Again, I'm staying neutral on this. I don't know, quite simply, who has the greater legacy. That's why I'm staying neutral on this. I can see both sides of the argument. The most common comment I got was, Manny Pacquiao's an 8-weight world champion. That's never been done before. That's proof that he's the greatest of all time. Well, Fight Film also called him the greatest of all time. And additionally to calling him the greatest of all time, and I'm bringing up Fight Film, by the way, because he made a video sort of attacking my video, like I said. He also said that another objective proof of that is the fact that Floyd Mayweather's won only 4 lineal titles, whereas Manny Pacquiao's won 5. So let's get to the bottom of this. We'll start off with the whole concept of weight categories and winning titles in 8 weight divisions. Saying someone's the best of all time for that is problematic because we haven't always had the same amount of weight divisions. Up until 1962, the light middleweight division, for example, didn't exist. So let's say you were a welterweight in 1957, 1958, and you won a welterweight title, and then you jumped up to middleweight because that was the next weight up, and you won a middleweight title. Does that make you less great than a fighter today who would win a welterweight title, move up, win a light middleweight title, and then also win a middleweight title just because he had the opportunity afforded to him? Does that make him a greater fighter? Additionally to that, you've also got the question of how many championships are available today. There are 4 governing bodies. There weren't always 4 governing bodies. So it's easier to win a title today, a version of a title today. So this whole idea of an 8-weight world champion, is that really how we look at this? Or do you have to be the guy? Now, when it comes to being the guy, do we look at lineal titles or do we look at who's the undisputed? Who's the main man, undisputed or unified? I don't know. Only 6-7 fighters have ever become undisputed, but while there have been 4 governing bodies. So it's very, very difficult to achieve that. But what you can be, I guess, is a unified title holder and to be, you know, the main guy without dispute. Was Manny Pacquiao the main guy without dispute in the welterweight division? If so, what happened when he lost to Floyd Mayweather? Because the dispute was between the two, right? Now, do we consider Floyd to have been the main man at welterweight when they finally fought each other and not Manny? Or do you consider Manny to have been the main man, then Floyd took that mantelpiece? How does it work? Or, as many people are saying, and this is a legitimate comment, by the way, that styles make fights. And this is a guy called Boxing Fan made this comment on one of my videos. Styles make fights, he's saying, and ultimately, just because you have the style to get the better of somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean you're the better or greater fighter. And that's very true. And that is a well thought out and intellectually put comment. Without bias, that's a fair thing to say. In the preview to the fight, I explained that I thought that Manny Pacquiao would lose the fight. And one of the reasons was, apart from the decline in his output as he began to age, from 1,000 punches a fight to 600 punches a fight in the 3 fights preceding the Floyd Mayweather fight. So when Fight Film and others are talking about a shoulder injury being the cause of that decline, unless that shoulder injury was going on for years beforehand, then it's not the reason for the decline in output. He just wasn't the same guy, physically speaking. His style had changed. Now, that frenetic force of nature, which might have caused problems to Floyd earlier in his career, perhaps was no longer going to do that. But one of the other major reasons for that, talking of styles, is the fact that Floyd has an uncanny ability to be able to use his fantastic range to maintain range. His fantastic length to maintain range. And while other taller fighters that Manny had fought in the past, guys like Margarito, guys like Oscar De La Hoya, they're a lot more square on and willing to hold their feet and engage. Floyd is more of a fencer. He's looking to land and counter and then jump out of range, just like a cat fighting a snake. Paws away and then jumps out of range. Now, because of that, I knew that Manny, with his shorter arms and shorter legs, as fast as his legs were, I didn't believe that he would have the speed advantage to be able to close that range consistently. And what he would have to try and do is punch with Floyd. But because of Floyd's length advantage, he'd be often in a situation where he's throwing punches and not getting caught. So that was the question between the two fighters. And getting the better of someone doesn't necessarily mean you are the greater fighter, as I've said in the past. So let's go back to this concept of, does it make you greater if you've won more titles at different weight categories? I think I've shown that why that doesn't apply necessarily. And does it make you greater to have won lineal titles too? Well, when it comes to the lineal titles, the 5th lineal title for Manny Pacquiao was a knockout victory over Ricky Hatton at light welterweight. Well, this came after Floyd Mayweather had already knocked Ricky Hatton out. So do you value that win as somehow decisive in the question of who's greater between Floyd and Manny, just because he happened to be a lineal title holder who Floyd had recently already dominated and knocked out? Is that what we're talking about here? Maybe, but if you are going to do that, the reason you're going to do it is because of something I mentioned in the original video, and that is that Manny Pacquiao is naturally smaller than Floyd. And Ricky was a lineal title holder at light welterweight. He lost the fight against Floyd at welterweight. So the fact that Manny was smaller potentially means that he was better than Floyd pound for pound, because had they been the same size, so to speak, as Max Kellerman has suggested, that he would have been the greater fighter. So I'm posing both sides of the argument here. I'm telling you why the question of a lineal title, an extra lineal title, doesn't necessarily mean you're superior. But at the same time, I'm explaining to you, it could mean that, because there is a size discrepancy and you're not judging two guys that are exactly the same size. Floyd went through 5 weight categories. Manny went through 8 weight categories. Both are incredible achievements, to the extent where many people consider them both to have been drugs cheats as a result of that, because they cannot fathom the possibility of a fighter doing what he did. Guys like Paulie Malignaggi, 2-weight world champion, considers it impossible for Manny Pacquiao to have maintained his destructive power and speed as he moved through the weight categories. That's how great of an achievement it was. So is it a legitimate argument to say that it's only what's palpable that should be judged? Yes, it's a legitimate argument, but don't pretend that it's the only argument and that anything else is somehow biased. It's not. There are nuanced discussions here. The other thing that people have come up to me with, and again, Fight Film said this, is that I'm cherry picking specific subsets, specific eons or periods of Manny Pacquiao's career, rather than looking at Manny Pacquiao's career in its entirety. No, I wasn't. What I was saying is, because there is no set definition, there are different people that observe it in different ways, and you've only got to go and look at some of the comments to understand that. Some people will look at it your way, where they will look at it and they'll say, right, Lineal titles, championships, that's all that matters. There are other people, though, that won't say that. And they'll say it's about peak. If it's not about peak, and peak doesn't matter, and you want to look at career in its entirety, then please explain to me how you justify in your mind Manny Pacquiao's knockout loss in the third round against Rustico Torrecampo. This was in his 12th fight. Rustico was no great fighter. He had 15 wins and 8 losses by the end of his career. Of those 15 wins, only 8 of them were by knockout. So you're not talking about a huge puncher here. And he also had 6 draws. How do you justify that? How do you justify that in his 28th fight, he also had a knockout loss at the hands of Sungsurit? How do you justify that? Third round again, TKO that time. Now, the way I justify it is by saying that wasn't yet Manny Pacquiao. He was green. He had yet to become the fighter that he could have become. So in other words, I am applying subjectivity because that's what you do in a nuanced debate. It's not just necessarily about the hard data. Yes, the hard data is important, but you also have to know what you're looking at. Otherwise, is Joe Louis the greatest heavyweight of all time and Vladimir Klitschko's the second greatest because of how long they were dominant for and how many fights they won and stuff like that? Or are you going to be more nuanced and look at some of the opposition they fought? There was a reason they used to say Joe Louis was for a long period fighting a bum of the month club. Let's talk about the Schmeling fight with Joe Louis. Yeah, everybody talks about that in the Western world, and that's brilliant because, I say it's brilliant, it was brilliant at the time because there was this concept of, well, essentially propaganda. It was a culture war going on. But if you want to look beyond that and you want to be honest about what happened, when they were both nearer their peak, Schmeling knocked Louis out. By the time Schmeling fought Louis in the rematch, Schmeling was completely washed up. He was old, he was finished, and he got destroyed. And yet people portrayed it as, this is a fact, that Joe Louis is superior. Look at what happened. He's the better man. He's the best of the era. Was he? Or did he just fight a washed up guy? Maybe he was. I don't know. You tell me. But the point is you need that nuance. You need to look into certain things and consider what's going on and what you're watching and why things are happening when they're happening. Floyd Mayweather, are we going to turn around and say he beat a prime Canelo Alvarez? Or are you going to say he had yet to reach his peak? He was drained at 152.5 pounds. And this Canelo Alvarez today destroys that Canelo Alvarez. So you have to apply nuance. You have to look at what was going on at the time. And you have to call out bias. I spoke earlier about the differing weight categories and how you would jump up from welterweight directly to middleweight. And this is what I always try to do when I say I want to give both sides of the argument rather than just come across as a fanboy and trying to boost one guy's name or reputation just because it's the prevailing narrative. The prevailing narrative is that Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest fighter of all time. This is what many people, most people, anecdotally speaking, I'm speaking anecdotally, seem to say. Well, one of his signature wins was against Carmen Basilio. Now, Carmen Basilio was a fantastic fighter in his own right, and it was a controversial win for Ray Robinson. It was a split decision that many people felt he lost. He also did legitimately lose a fight to Carmen Basilio as well. Now, Basilio was a welterweight, smaller, much smaller, shorter. He was a smaller guy than Robinson, and he jumped up to fight Robinson. And it's one of Robinson's signature wins, one of the big names on his CV, on his resume. Whereas when Gennady Golovkin fought Kell Brook, who was a massive welterweight and there was no, like I said, back then there would have been no light middleweight division, he would have jumped up straight up to middleweight. Jumped straight up to middleweight and fought Gennady Golovkin. Natural, that's natural. If he was there around back then, he would have fought Sugar Ray Robinson at middleweight. Why does Golovkin get undermined for beating a terrific fighter in Kell Brook when Kell was in his peak and in his prime? As though, look, he's just a smaller guy. What's the big deal? But Ray Robinson gets credit. You see why you have to apply nuance and you can't just say, well, one particular guy jumped up one weight class whereas the other guy jumped 2 weight classes, when in reality they did the same thing. So this is what I mean, where you subjectivity is fine. Bias is when you, not in the way that because there are various definitions of bias, but in the way that Fight Film himself considers bias, it's to be unfair in your analysis. Well, isn't it unfair, therefore, to focus on the things you guys are focusing on and explain as though we have to, on the one hand, you want to eradicate subjectivity completely and speak merely about the statistical elements of the lineal titles without looking into it and the 8-weight world champs without looking into it. But at the same time, talking about how excitement equates to greatness. It's perfectly legitimate, like I said, to believe that winning hearts and minds equates to greatness. Arturo Gatti, Mickey Ward, they weren't elite level skilled fighters, but because of their heart and soul and leaving that in the ring, they transcended the sport in many regards and became great. Maybe that's your definition, but that's also subjective. So you can't on the one hand pretend subjectivity shouldn't exist and that you are objective, and then on the other hand uphold concepts that are subjective. And talking of subjectivity and bias, I also had many people take exception to the fact that I referred to Andre Ward as a great fighter. Is this some sort of a joke? Even if you thought that Andre Ward cheated against Kovalev, okay, let's say, and throughout much of his career, a lot of people would say, oh, he's leading with his head to split the guard. That's true, he does that, right? He's a dirty fighter, just like Floyd Mayweather throws up the forearm, just like Lomachenko pulls down the guard to throw a right hook or a left hook, which you're not allowed to do, okay? Just like Bernard Hopkins punches a guy in the hip to try and give him a dead leg. Yeah, these things happen. Headlocks, leaning on a guy, choking a guy. These things happen in the sport. It's a fight. I know it's called the gentlemanly sport, but at the end of the day, it's a fight. They're going to do whatever they can to get ahead. Now, when it comes to Sergey Kovalev, I did say I didn't feel that Andre Ward won the first fight. So I'm not some Andre Ward fanboy. I also came out here and I said that for me, the second fight was not definitive. And at the point, I had Andre Ward fans calling me a fanboy of Kovalev because of this. Because of the fact of the matter is, it was a nip and tuck fight. Kovalev was tiring, but you can get a second wind, and we see that consistently happen in fights. A low blow was landed. He would have had 5 minutes to recover. Multiple low blows were landed, and the fight was stopped. Did we really get a definitive answer to who was greater between these two fantastic fighters in their peak? I don't think we did, which is a shame. I would have loved to have seen a third fight while they were both at their prime and their peak. However, even if you give the first fight to Kovalev and the second fight you score a no contest, Andre Ward won the Super Six, which is the equivalent of the Super Series today. He was a lineal super middleweight champion, something that you clearly uphold and consider to be valuable and important, right? A subjective method of analysis of greatness. He beat the likes of Carl Froch, Arthur Abraham, Beaker, Kessler, Chad Dawson, Alan Green. But Andre Ward's not a great fighter. This is the level of bias that we're dealing with, that I'm having to deal with now by answering all these questions. How can, if he's not a great fighter and he's a run-of-the-mill fighter, Olympic gold medalist as well, I missed that out. If he's just a run-of-the-mill fighter, then what makes Kovalev a great fighter? Why did he struggle so much against him? What happened there? Come on, man. Then I had comments like when I was talking about Floyd potentially, Khan potentially beating Floyd Mayweather and saying that Floyd ducked, in my opinion, Amir Khan. People were making the case of Khan lost to Danny Garcia, Thurman beat Danny Garcia, and Pacquiao beat Thurman. Since when does a triangle theory work in boxing? Especially when those fights were years apart. Like, what a ludicrous comment. Come on, man. Let's be honest. You guys want to be honest? Let's be honest. Now, one very legitimate, like I said, argument is that styles make fights, and it was just 36 minutes. That's it. Floyd got the better of Manny in 36 minutes. Had it been earlier in their careers, the fight might have gone differently. That's a very legitimate argument because Pacquiao was a different fighter. When it comes to the Floyd fans, here's my criticism of you guys. A lot of you were coming to me and saying, how can you even ask this question? Because Floyd Mayweather beat Manny Pacquiao and he was undefeated. So how can Manny be better than Floyd if he beats Errol Spence when he's never beaten Floyd? To be the man, you've got to beat the man. So how could I give him credit for that? Well, I hope you guys are consistent. If that's your only method of basis for analysis, your basis for your position, I hope you guys are consistent when you're considering who's greater between Roy Jones Jr. and Joe Calzaghe. Because Joe Calzaghe's undefeated and Roy Jones isn't. Joe Calzaghe beat Roy Jones Jr. just like Floyd beat Manny Pacquiao. But is he greater? If you're going to tell me he's not greater, again, you've got to apply subjectivity. What are you going to tell me? When Roy Jones was at his absolute peak, he was untouchable? Well, how's that different to what Manny Pacquiao fans are saying? When Manny was at his peak, he was untouchable. This is why peak, the question of peak, matters. And not just holistically about a legacy. If you are Usain Bolt and you break a world record, the fastest man ever to run, and boxing is, of course, very different from athletics and track and field because those are specific set numbers. There's no argument. They're numbers. But let's say Usain Bolt wins a gold medal, 1 gold medal, and breaks the world record. And another guy comes along after that and beats Usain Bolt at the following Olympic Games when Usain Bolt is no longer as fast as he used to be. And he wins a gold. And then in the next Olympics, he wins another gold. And in the next Olympics, he wins another gold. And the one after that, he wins another gold. And you're sitting there going, wow, man, 4 Olympic Games, 4 gold medals. That's incredible. The longevity to be able to maintain that is unbelievable. But he never broke Usain Bolt's record. It's perfectly legitimate to say when Usain Bolt was at his peak, he's the fastest man of all time, untouchable, the best ever. Perfectly legitimate. It's also perfectly legitimate to see it the other way and say, actually, to be able to maintain that high level throughout your career, that longevity is what makes him greater. They're legitimate arguments, but they're different. So this concept that you've only got one possible definition of greatness is ludicrous. You might look at the highest highs. Who achieved the biggest obstacles? Who made you go, wow, man, time and time again? But who also had the lowest lows? Because some people have been saying a great fighter like Floyd would never, ever lose to a guy like Ristico. So clearly, if you're losing to Ristico Torrecampo, you can't have been that good. So do you judge the lowest of the lows? I'm not saying that's my position. I'm merely presenting to you what all of the various positions are. And then I'm asking for your opinion. So this idea that I'm somehow biased against Manny Pacquiao, when I was desperately wanting Manny Pacquiao to beat Floyd Mayweather, I enjoyed his style of fighting more. I enjoyed Floyd's too, in a different way, to be honest with you, from a purist perspective. But in terms of sheer excitement, preferred Manny. The way he conducted himself and carried himself, I preferred Manny. Floyd never came across as a likable guy to me. Additionally to that, in my opinion, Floyd Mayweather has this concept of you must never lose your zero. To me, that he instilled is damaging in the sport, because now you have a lot of guys that are afraid to lose their zero, their loss, they're afraid to pick up that L. So I'm not some Floyd Mayweather fanboy or Flomo, as some of you clowns have been calling me, right? I'm simply telling you both sides of the argument. I don't know who's greater. You tell me. There's legitimate arguments for both ends of the spectrum. And listen, I do like Fight Film, okay? I've chatted to him for many years and we've had many clashes over the years. And I enjoy the clashes I have with him because I know he's an intelligent guy. I've also agreed with him staunchly on many things too. And like I said, he is very intelligent. But he's also very biased. And the reason I know he's biased is because prior to any fight occurring, I know exactly what his narrative's going to be post-fight. We all do. Anyone that's ever seen his channel knows. He's got his favourite fighters and somehow he will spin it in their favour. I mean, I've seen people send me videos of Manny Pacquiao outlanding Floyd Mayweather, and this is something that Fight Film spoke about too. Based on what? I mean, he had him winning 8 rounds to 4. Based on what? The concept of they're not clean punches. So what they'll do is I'll say to you, yeah, it's not with the knuckle part of the punch. And they'll sit there and they'll completely disregard a left hook that might have landed, because it might have landed with a slight inner part of the glove. And somebody today sent me a video. Somebody called Rokuro Tanizaki sent a video, posted the video on numerous occasions, where they're counting the punch count. And the irony is, on 1 minute and 8 seconds of that video, the punch they score for Manny Pacquiao lands with his forearm into Floyd's body. So make up your minds. But if we're only talking about the knuckle part, as though this is back in the day amateur boxing, whereby only the white part of the glove would count as a punch, then if that's all the only way you want to score it, then I'm sure you never had Joe Calzaghe winning a fight in your life, right? Because he must have been a slapper. If you're landing with the glove and it's a punch in the head, whether you land with the knuckle or this little section here or the inner section, if it gets through, it's a punch. Don't give me none of this stuff about it has to hit with the knuckle. This isn't amateur boxing. Regardless of, even if you're going to tell me some obscure law about, yes, it should be with the knuckle or something like that, it's a fight, it's a punch. Punches are scored all the time when they hit like that. Canelo Alvarez has made a career from landing monstrous left hooks to the body, where often the case he hits with the inner part of the glove. And on my video talking about Joseph Parker, I spoke about how he can have more effective punching technique to become more destructive using the knuckles and turning over those knuckles. Yes, you can be more effective in your punch, but it doesn't mean that if you're not going to turn over the knuckles that the punch doesn't count. So what they try to do is this sneaky sort of manipulation of what counts as a punch to try and make out as though Manny Pacquiao somehow was outlanding and beating Floyd Mayweather. This is a ridiculous level of bias, guys. I wanted Pacquiao to win on the one or two occasions, one occasion in particular, where he seemed to hurt Floyd. I was up on my feet. I was, I'd spotted it quite early, in fact. I thought Floyd did a little stumble that nobody else around me at the time had noticed. I was watching it with 4 or 5 people, and I jumped on my feet. I said, he's hurt him. And they were looking at me like, what? No, he hasn't. And Floyd had a really good poker face. And about 20 seconds later, it was when Floyd's, or 30 seconds, whatever it was, Floyd's back was up on the ropes and he was just covering up. And Manny was trying to unload. And to be honest with you, Manny didn't do a great job when Floyd was up on the ropes at that moment, to be honest. But that's by the by. At the time, I thought that, you know, this could be something. And they go, oh my word, you're right. He has hurt him. I was up on my feet. I wanted Pacquiao to beat Floyd. But I'm not a fanboy. That's the difference. I'm honest, and I'm going to put both sides of the argument across. They're both great fighters. You can make a fair case for either one. Another thing that people have said is, you brought up Marquez and the fact that Floyd was more dominant against Marquez than Manny Pacquiao was. But you're not talking about Manny Pacquiao being more dominant against other common opponents. Floyd won those fights. He beat Ricky Hatton. He might have stopped him later than Manny Pacquiao did, but he beat him. He beat Miguel Cotto. And yes, he might not have stopped him in the way that Manny Pacquiao destroyed him, but he still beat him. And the irony is this, and again, I'm not saying they're necessarily right about this, but what do Marquez, Hatton and Cotto have in common? They all feel that Floyd Mayweather was harder to beat. They all feel that he was the better fighter. What does that mean? I don't know. It might just mean that their specific style wasn't as successful against Floyd's style as it would have been against Manny's, so to speak. Again, successful, the question of successful is subjective when they all lost. But what we're ultimately talking about here is the idea of what their perception was. And perception doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. But it's interesting that the guys that actually fought them seem to think that Floyd was the harder guy to beat. Why? Sugar Shane Mosley too. Why? What's that all about? Another thing as well, for Floyd fans, this is overcoming obstacles that seem insurmountable is what equates sometimes to the legend, the mythology of greatness. So Floyd's cherry picking in terms of his timing does affect his legacy. A lot of people say, oh yeah, but Floyd, no matter what he did, he couldn't win. People would always find an excuse. That's because a lot of those excuses were legitimate. Okay. Cotto was not at his best by the time he fought Floyd. And a lot of people will turn and say, yeah, but Cotto fought Manny afterwards. Exactly. Right. So that's a knock on the Pacquiao claims as well. But it still doesn't deduct from the fact that Cotto, when he was at his peak and considered a real threat to Floyd, Floyd didn't take the fight. There's no doubting that Hatton was smaller, that Marquez was smaller, that he took Canelo when Canelo was green and he drained him, that Amir Khan was the guy, the name that all the fans voted for on Floyd's own poll for the fight to take place. The vast majority of the fans did. And Floyd, who always spoke about being the money man, Money Mayweather, right? The reason he's fighting Canelo Alvarez, the reason he's fighting Manny Pacquiao when he fought him is because now the fight's worth 300 million. It's all about the money. Nothing to do with letting him get older and letting his abilities decline, right? Nothing to do with that. It's just about the money. Okay, well, if it was about the money, why did he not fight Amir Khan when that was the money fight? And instead he fought Marcos Maidana twice and Andre Berto and Robert Guerrero. Why did he take those fights rather than Amir Khan? Because he knew that Amir Khan was a massive threat to him. And that is going to affect people's perception of what makes a guy great. It doesn't mean he's not great. They're both great fighters. But let's not pretend that that's not a besmirching of his name, because it is. Now, one final comment regarding this concept of lineal titles and who wins the most lineal titles. Rocky Marciano never lost a fight in his life. So he was a one-time lineal champ. Does that mean I should hold it against him when I'm comparing him to someone, say, like Muhammad Ali, who's a three-time lineal champ? Because Muhammad Ali first vacated and then he had losses. How about Canelo Alvarez? This is a question to Fight Film, because in the past, Fight Film has said, Golovkin, this is what pound for pound looks like. And he showed footage of Golovkin. Whereas in his video where he criticizes me, he says, pound for pound is going through weight categories. That's what it is. That's what it equates to. How well you go through weight categories. Not necessarily how dominant you are compared to your peers in your own division. Well, if that's the case, why do you rate Canelo Alvarez lower than Golovkin? Canelo's the one that's gone through the weight categories. Golovkin isn't. Does that mean we couldn't rate Hagler on a pound for pound list either? Because he didn't go through weight categories? So let's be consistent. If you're going to call other people biased and question their integrity and suggest that I was out here trying to manipulate people and trying to be sneaky, let's talk about you. Let's talk about what you're saying here. Is Canelo greater than Golovkin? Is he better than Golovkin pound for pound? Who's got more lineal titles? Thanks for watching, everyone. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.